that has come up is the fact that Ireland will lose its veto in 33 areas if the Lisbon Treaty is passed, when those areas switch from unanimous voting to qualified majority voting. Now, opponents of the treaty say that this is too much power for a country like Ireland to give over to a political bloc that represents 500 million people. Now, what would you say to that argument?
Well, first of all, I'm glad that they accept that it's 33 and not 173, which is what Sinn Féin was saying. And the second point about it is that not all of the 33, of course, will apply to Ireland, because we've an opt-in right in Justice and Home Affairs. And the third and the most important point is that the decisions, whether it's by qualified majority voting or unanimity, will ultimately be made by the Council of Ministers, and of course we're represented on the Council of Ministers. And remember this, in terms of making decisions in Europe, we've never had what you call an overwhelming vote. We have 7 votes out of 345 at the moment. The new voting system is rather more complex, but it represents the equality of member states and their citizens. I think the most important thing, however, is that we've retained our vetoes on the areas that are of most concern to us. For example, on taxation. There's a veto because there's a requirement of human liberty and defence, or neutrality is therefore protected. And the right to life of the unborn child, which is protected by an article in our constitution, is still protected.
So you feel that the areas that we are moving to qualified majority voting on are acceptable?
I do. I do. I think it's a fair point to make that. I think people who don't participate in the European Council or the Council of Ministers meetings probably have a different view. And that's because currently the European Council and the Council of Ministers are behind closed doors. Under this treaty, the doors will be open and people will be able to see the way the decisions are made. The decisions are very seldom made when people sort of say, oh, we can't call a vote at this stage. That's not the way it actually happens. But it is important that you have a voting process that allows the Union to move on. Remember, one of the problems with having unanimity in all sorts of areas is it's often very, very hard to find a compromise in those cases. But if you actually have a consensus voting system, like the new system, you try and you work out a consensus. There's never been an experience, in my experience, and I was a civil servant for a long number of years, I've never come across any occasion, and I don't think anybody ever has, where you've had all the other member states ganging up on any individual member state to do it harm. That's not the way the Union works. And I think we need to sort of think of it and have a different narrative about the way Europe works than we have. Again, the point I make is that if you look at the areas about how a committee operates within its it's not earth-shattering stuff.
Well, I know that some of the opponents of the treaty say the fact that that veto exists, with regards to what you're saying about the consensus, the fact that that veto exists actually changes the whole nature of these discussions and what proposals are made and what acts are adopted, because it's known there that if it's unacceptable to a particular group, they won't move forward.
Well, you see, I don't think that's a positive way of looking at it. I mean, it's very much in Europe's interest. Let me give you specific areas, because I think it's easier for people to think of specifics rather than in the abstract. In the area of justice and home affairs, where there is a need to fight cross-border crime, there is a need to fight crimes like people trafficking, drug trafficking, international fraud, all of those crimes that you really can't handle as an individual country. What you need to work towards in Europe is a way that the European Union as a whole can combine to deal with those particular issues. And if you're actually going to have an absolute veto on everything, it's just impossible to move forward. Now, it's a very interesting example of where Europe looks for a compromise. I mean, the solution in this, for example, in this treaty, when you move from qualified majority vote, from unanimity to qualified majority voting in the justice and home affairs areas, if a member state feels that its any fundamental principle is affected, it can apply what's called an emergency brake. Then the decision is kicked upstairs to the European Council, as the Council of Heads of State and Government, where a decision will be made by unanimity. So you see, it's not a question of somebody out to get the little states or out to get Ireland. That's not what Europe is about.
Okay, and Patricia, one of the issues that's going to be one of the most important issues that will be facing voters this Thursday will be the removal of our veto, the Irish veto, in 33 policy areas, when those areas actually switched from unanimous voting to qualified majority voting. Now, supporters of the treaty actually say that this is necessary to improve decision making within the enlarged EU, and that actually we've kept an opt-out on the most areas, and we've kept a veto on the most important areas to Ireland. Do you feel that the losses we're making here are acceptable?
No, first of all, it's not making things easier. It's basically making it easier for things to be passed that we may not agree with, because we lose our opportunity to block something that may not be in our interest. And the areas we lose control on are quite significant. I mean, you have justice, policing, you have public health, public services, space, which also involves the issue of military, sport and culture. And these are areas like where there may be serious problems, and we don't no longer have the possibility to stop something going ahead because we will be outvoted, because it's going to be a qualified majority. Our vote's already dropped in relation to its weight in the population criteria, and then on top of that we won't be able to stop something. Now people will argue, oh well, the veto's never used anyway, but it's there as a mechanism to ensure you can get consensus. And what we're moving away from is consensus decision making to basically majority rule. And I think that's a major problem, because there are many times when it's not going to be in Ireland's interest to go along with something, but we will have no alternative.
Well, I know that certain elements of the government and the opposition parties have stated that it's quite a negative approach to expect to be able to use your veto to kind of force people to come around to your way of thinking, and that actually, you know, we require an effective decision-making process at the heart of Europe to be able to tackle big issues that are facing the globe, the world at the moment, such as cross-border crime, people trafficking, things like this.
Well, on the cross-border crime and people trafficking, at the moment we're opting out of that, so I wouldn't, if I were the government, I wouldn't be promoting that. Having said that, I mean, it is a serious area, and we're opting in at the earliest opportunity the government has declared that. On the issue of the veto, the government will tell you, and the yes side, that we never use the veto, and I would believe that is correct, because when you have a veto there, everybody else around the table knows that if you don't want something, you can stop it. Therefore, they will come to some agreement and a common kind of consensus. So everybody will give and take to a certain extent to ensure that they can actually allow something to go ahead, and that nobody will use the veto to block it. So that the veto, yes, I would believe that it doesn't be used because of the fact that it ensures and forces the member states to reach a common ground. But that will be gone. That necessity to reach a common ground will be gone, and the more powerful countries know that they can outvote the smaller ones.
So you feel that it certainly will be more harmful to Ireland and more harmful to the smaller countries of Europe?
Most definitely, particularly if it's areas maybe where we fundamentally disagree with the European Union on specific issues. We will have a problem there. And the government also talk about this idea, you know, of an emergency brake that you can use. But when you actually examine that closely, all it means is that they can go to the heads of state, where they have to come to some sort of agreement unanimously, fine. But it still has to go back to the Council of Ministers and be voted by qualified majority. So it would still be going ahead anyway. So this kind of an emergency brake is not really an emergency brake, it's only just a slowdown.
Okay. Just a bit more detail, what exactly is the emergency brake then?
Well, it means that if, for example, a member state has a major problem, what they can do, the issue will have to go to the heads of state, and they will have to come to some sort of unanimous agreement. But the heads of state, unless you actually can get the big heads of state to agree, say for example if there's only one country there, like Ireland, objecting to something, the other countries will know that when it goes back to the table again, it has to be voted by in that council by qualified majority, and they know they can basically hold out and ensure that they can get their way. Because we would have to have all the big countries and all the other countries supporting us to get major changes. So it's just slowing the process down and going through the motions, but at the end of the day, it leaves the situation as it is, that they can still outvote us.